plenty of you have asked for an invade guide, so here we go. First of all, what's important about invades is they are risky at the moment. Invades used to be a very rewarding strategy, but over time and with the item changes, for example the removal of red pot, they have become a lot more complex and often less rewarding. Typically, when you invade now, you're not looking for kills anymore, you're mostly looking to steal a buff. While in earlier times you had the choice to either go for the buff steal or just kill one of the enemies. Yes, there are still invades where people try to kill someone, but they're very, very rare, as your early power on level 1 is often lower than it used to be. Also, always keep in mind, if you fail an invade, you fall behind drastically, you lose out on XP, you lose out on your own buffs, you may be later to lane. So it's really worth considering if you should be taking the risk or not. I generally would not recommend invading for beginners unless you have a very, very strong comp and you're very sure of why you're doing it. At the same time, you obviously need to know what happens in the case of an invade, so this video will also be an advisor for people who are trying to prevent getting invaded and need to know where enemies are coming from, how you can prevent getting invaded best, how you can see it beforehand, and what to do when you still get invaded. Let's start with the invade points on the conquest map. Now, the red points are those points where invades on a dual lane can happen from, towards the red buff at the top. The white points are the same for the solo lane, with the speed buff and the blue buff. All of these scenarios can happen. We will go through them in game and I can show you better where the player will be coming from and where they'll be moving towards, but these are the points you have to generally keep in mind where an enemy could attack you from. It's relatively alright to ward them. I wouldn't say easy, but it's not that hard, so if you ward up you will be able to prevent most of these invades, at least from being unseen. And now let's jump into the game and look at the invade points. The first thing you can do but don't have to do is ward on the enemy camp. This goes both for preventing invades and for invading, because you will know if the enemies are there, if they have wrath, if it's hard to invade that way, and also if they might be looking to invade you by not showing up there at any point. Now let's look at the invade positions. The first one is from middle lane, and this is one that's often forgotten, as no one will really check middle lane early on. You can just hide on the side of the wall here, and you are very likely to actually not be seen that way, and then you can just go over to the speed buff in most scenarios. Similarly, you can just hide behind the harpy camp, which means you have a much further path, but you're not going to be seen as easily. You can also really hide closer as well if you just stand here, or you can take that path later on, shortly before the buff camp spawns, and still be relatively hidden if the enemy tries to scout out last second. In the same way, you can obviously hide on the wall on the other side, but the distance is even slightly longer, so this is more of a safe invade spot than anything else. There are also the pillars by the fire giant pit, though you are typically relatively easy seen there, whereas on the right side of it you're not as easily seen. Even more aggressive is the second pillar, but you really have to be wary of enemies scouting you out here. Another often relatively unexpected invade path is the right lane. Typically you wouldn't have minions here that early on, obviously, and you can just hide on the right side, far out, and many people will not go here to scout. So it's a really good invade path that allows you to go both to the speed buff as well as the blue buff. And even up to here, you're relatively unseen unless the enemy is looking exactly in your direction, which means they have less options to scout out other directions. While we're already here, let's take a quick look at how much health a buff camp has to have to get killed by Wrath. You'll see me Wrath shortly before the camp would die, right here, and then I need one more basic. So you see that on level 1, it's relatively easy to steal a buff with Wrath, as it takes a very large amount of health from the buff camp. If you want to lower your chances of being seen on the solo, you can always hide in between here as well, but it makes it a little easier to scout if an enemy is specifically looking towards that direction. That way you can also easily invade blue buff once again. Now let's look at the invade points on dual lane. They're very similar in a sense. You still have those around the mid camps on both sides of those, obviously, or you can go further in and hide next to the harpies. Same thing as on the other side of the map. Once again, you can also hide in middle lane. You have to be a little careful here because you can actually be seen like right in between, so if you don't watch out, you will be spotted out. For reference, this is how you can see the enemy from the buff camp if you look over there. Then there are obviously the options on the left side. You can hide behind the wall, behind the Gold Fury. You can even go deep into the Gold Fury, but I'd hardly ever do that because you're very, very visible there. Or you can go into left lane once again, which will rarely be scouted out, and hide somewhere there, either behind the pillar or just right on the side, and invade from there. In this scenario, you don't really want to invade the boars, they're not worth as much as a buff camp early on, so you want to go straight for red, no matter where you're invading from. And while we're here, let's look at the Wrath damage once again. In this case, I will deal enough damage to be sure to secure the camp with Wrath, not running the risk of having to head one more basic afterwards, but just be absolutely sure that you will secure the camp. That's right at that point. It takes a while to get used to that exact damage point where it's enough, but you will get a feeling for it on your own buffs, and then you can look for invade further. This is also one of the reasons why I think invading should probably mostly be done by people who have played the game for a while. Now let's look at the ward spots that counter invades. Once again, you can put a ward on the enemy buff to see if he's invading, but other than that, this point at the mid camps on both sides of the map is very, very efficient. It is covered a lot. You have the option to put a ward where I just put it on the left side, which will make sure that you can see all potential invades. However, you see them relatively late. Often you will not be invaded from the lane, and you can instead put your ward closer to the Gold Fury. You can still cover pretty much any other area but the left lane invade, which is a rare one. So this one I think is still a decent ward. On the solo side of the map, things look very similar. You still have that one around the mid harpies, which will basically cover half of the invade options relatively early, and then on the right side it's a little more complex. You can either once again go for the one ward that prevents the lane invade as well, but will give you vision a little later, or you can put the ward closer to the fire giant, and that way make sure that you will see invades earlier on, but not be as sure that you will see an invade from solo lane directly. Meaning you have to scout out solo lane more, but that's relatively easy. You can just scout and that way prevent having to place the ward, knowing that you will see them relatively early if the enemies invade from solo lane. Now let's look at scouting path. Typically you have at least 2 players on one lane, so you have 2 players that can scout different areas. This is scouting path 1, which includes the solo lane, as well as the side of the fire giant pit, and then you just look into the fire giant pit, check if someone's there. And you basically can do this path over and over. Just check the sides, just so you can see anyone hiding behind the pillars, and you'll go back to where you started. Simultaneously, a second player can do the other half of the round, check behind the harpies as well, check if there's someone on the side, go into middle lane, check if someone's coming from there, and then go back to the harpies and all the way to the fire elementals. So you can assure that you have at least covered half of the map, knowing that they can only hide very, very far in the back, making them take a long path and running the risk of getting discovered. On the dual lane side, things are very similar. Here you also want to check in middle lane, see if someone's coming from there. Then check at the harpies, check at the side of the harpies so they're not hiding in there. Check at Gold Fury and around Gold Fury and go back for the first player. While the second player scouts around Gold Fury, checks at the side of the Gold Fury, and then checks all the way over to the dual lane to make sure no one's coming from there. I think the lanes are the most crucial part here, as long as you ward, as you need to know if someone's coming from the lane where you can't exactly ward. With 3 players on the left side, it's relatively easy to cover all these areas if you want to, so you can make sure that you're not getting invaded at least early on if the enemy steps out. Now for the one spot that is really, really rare, but possible. An enemy can hide behind your camp. They have to come out extremely early in the game in order to do that without getting seen, but from there they can invade you from the back and you have little to no escape potential. However, it's a big risk to do so, and if your invade fails, you have a problem. If the enemy has Wrath and you see it, you can't do much about it anymore. You're really, really dependent on just being fast and being a little lucky. You can spot out this point as well if you want to, but I think most of the time you're not going to find someone there. This invade is really rarely seen. So, to summarize, know the spots where you can get invaded from, know the spots where you should ward to prevent most invades, and know the spots where you should scout in order to prevent getting invaded. Now, what do you do if you get invaded? This depends on your comp. If you have Wrath, then you don't really have too much to fear, as long as you can time your Wrath right, as long as you know when to Wrath, because you can just secure your camp. If the enemy comp has significantly higher damage and power than you may want to watch out. If the enemy comp is, for example, a Thanatos and Bellona with the jungle and solo roles, then they may not look for the steal, they may be looking for early kills. If that's the case, your best bet is to just let go of the buff. Walk out and just don't give them a kill. Yes, you're going to drop an early buff, but you're not going to drop first blood right away, and that's what they're after, and especially Thanatos needs that. Thor, for example, is a similar god that can just invade very, very heavily and deal lots and lots of damage, so you might want to avoid even contesting a buff in that case. Just back out and make sure you survive, both of your players survive, and if possible, you can still go for the second buff, or as even in pro players games this happens, you just go straight for the lane, soak up the XP, make sure that even if you lose both buffs, you get at least the XP reward, as much of it as possible, and play for later in the game. Not every character is dependent on the buff all that much, and not every character benefits all that much from that buff, and if you know that the enemies will have to clear out their own buffs eventually, you can still look for later aggression there where they may not expect it as much. Obviously, giving up a buff is often a rather unwelcomed loss, but in the end, the sacrifice may be worth it. If you have gods that are able to fight back, then consider just holding onto your ability if you're expecting an invade. Just hold on all of your aggressive abilities, and the moment they come in, unload the abilities ideally on both the enemies and the camp. That way you can ensure that they will at least run a risk by keeping on invading, and they might just back out. In many other scenarios, even if you want to fight them, you want to let go of the camp first. The camp is going to deal damage to you that you want to avoid taking while getting invaded at the same time. So back out and turn on the players if you feel capable of fighting them. That's not always the case, but when it is the case, then go for it. Similarly, in duo lane, most of the invades will actually not be by multiple players. They will not be aggressive invades in, I would say, 95% of the cases, but rather support invades with Wrath, who will try and steal your buff and then get out because they're not that easy to kill. This can happen, just be aware of it. In this case, it especially helps to have a ward on the enemy camp, just so you know that they have Wrath and that the support's not showing up and they will come to you. Unleash the camp if possible, and maybe make the enemy pay for taking the buff by dying right away so they don't get any further benefit out of it and they have to go into duo lane without the support early on. Before we close this off, I want to stress once again that it is important only to invade when you know how to do it and you feel confident doing it. Don't do invade just because you think your comp has to do that. These days, invades are not nearly as rewarding as they were in earlier times, so they're really more something that you need for a cheesy strat or if you really feel like you need that early aggression. Thank you guys for watching. New video tomorrow. Duke Sloth, out.